嗨，大家好，欢迎收看《文化相对论》。今天我们的话题是社会治理。人是一种社会动物，只要有人在一起，就需要某种组织和规则来实现共同的利益。英文当中 governance 这个词在古希腊语中是掌舵的意思，它意味着管理和控制。各国在历史长河中演化出不同的社会治理模式，而在这场席卷全球的疫情大流行当中，都接受了一次大考。戴不戴口罩、打不打疫苗，似乎都成为人们争吵的来源。这不禁让我们想啊，在社会治理方面，封闭与开放、自由与秩序，是不是一个非此即彼的单选题呢？如果未来再发生类似的疫情，甚至我们几乎肯定啊，类似的危机还会发生，我们是否会表现得更好一点呢？每一期节目，我们都会邀请各界领袖和学者来探讨一个相关的话题，并且倾听各地年轻人的心声。我们首先有请这期节目的现场的两位嘉宾，分别是北京大学国际关系学院教授潘维先生和北京大学法学院教授朱苏丽先生。有请两位。您好，朱教授。您好，潘教授。Then I also introduce our two guests online. Professor Andres Wimmer from the Department of Sociology and Political Philosophy at Columbia University. And Professor Yuri Pines, sinologist from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. 今天我们因为在不同的时区，所以同时是早晨、下午和晚上啊，进行一个跨时空的这样一个连线。全球在面对疫情大流行当中，又进入到了一个新的阶段，依然存在很多的不确定性。那我首先想请各位嘉宾先分享一下，从你们的观察和分析来看，你们觉得哪些国家和地区做得比较好？
东亚的情况要比美国和欧洲做得好一些。
东亚国家相比较而言，注重社会整体的安全，尊重国家政权，或者相关的这种权威机构的一种协调措施。除了要考虑自己的利益之外，还要考虑其他的利益。
For me, this 1 year and a half were very tough because I am traveling all the time to China. My wife is in Beijing actually, so but it also allowed me to compare Israeli experience and Chinese experience in fighting the pandemic. Israel was very advanced in terms of vaccination. It does not solve all the problems, but it solves some of the problems. Dying of pandemics in Israel, it is 8,000 plus. But if China should adopt Israeli policies, in terms of the population in China, it will be 1 million. So this is an objective criterion to compare the performance of the governments.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated. All governments failed at a very basic level, especially in the first weeks and months. Basically, trusting government and then the ability of governments to enforce unpopular measurements, I think, are the two factors that explain variation in the relative success of countries in managing the crisis.
I completely agree that it depends on the government, on the trust of the government, but it depends also on the efficiency of the government and its ability to adapt itself. Chinese case at the beginning was disastrous, but then very rapidly, China readapted itself and became the most efficient country.
那其实呢，我们也采访了在各地的年轻人啊，来看一看他们对于当地的疫情的控制的情况，还有一些措施的反应是怎么样的。
New Zealand?
New Zealand, yeah. Germany, Belgium, Australia.
I don't know, but I doubt it was us.
I would say Europe and China.
China's done a really good job.
做得最好的一定是亚洲国家，可是我觉得也有一点太严格到有一点锁国。
5.
4. I'm saying 3, 4, 2.
Let's call it like a 2. It felt like safety was not the number one priority.
8分吧。
8分。
8分吧。
Stay at home, definitely. Stay at home.
Both? I don't know.
外出还是居家比较好。
肯定是居家。
尽量居家。
保持聚会，人和人之间不交流、不来往、不走动，
光天天拿手机看着对方的脸，我受不了。
哦，
戴口罩吧，看情况吧。
强制戴口罩。
Masks off. It drives me crazy, especially because my major is like performing arts.
Or and some freedom, but mostly order when it comes to COVID.
COVID, yeah.
虽然内心很想自由，但是还是要遵守秩序。
对，在遵守秩序的前提下，尽量自由一点。
我应该是中间，但是我会偏 follow 秩序。
I'm gonna say freedom. When I hear the word order, as an American, I fear that some of my rights may be taken away.
Okay, we have a very dynamic responses from these young people. 各地的这个防疫措施啊，各不相同，民众的接受程度和配合程度也是非常不一样的。好像很难简单的用东方与西方、民主或非民主、大政府还是小政府来做这样一种过于简单的区分。那么哪些特征或者哪些维度的评价能够说明这是一个好的治理呢？
在我看来，我是后果主义，努力、计划这都很重要，但是最后一定是一个结果的。
我也认为是好的结果。用中国话说叫做过日子，过好日子，也就是说能够比较顺利的，困难越来越少的养小孩、送老人。我认为这就叫做过好日子。
Good governance is actually a relatively recent concept. Good governance as an orientation towards the public good rather than the interests of a bureaucracy itself, but an orientation towards the well-being of the people.
I think that the most fundamental criterion is a government which preserves human dignity. One aspect is preserve human dignity from the infringing on your basic rights. And this is a Western idea. And the other is preserving human dignity by allowing welfare, by the government which invest in infrastructure for public good, with the government which eliminates poverty. And I think here is China's strength. It was rooted in Chinese ideologies. It was in the Chinese a very short Tianxia Weigong, the all under heaven exists for the common purpose, for the common good, and the government must also be for the common good.
Well, thank you. Professor Wimmer, as we have seen, the issue of policy responses to pandemic has been extremely politicized and polarized in the US. How would you explain that?
Well, everything in the United States right now is politicized and polarized. And when it comes to the pandemic, that's of course even more unfortunate. The federalist setup, where you have municipalities, counties, states, and then the federal government, each pursuing their own policies. And coordination between these different units is very weak.
In America, there's a deep-rooted anti-statist momentum or mentality. I remember Ronald Reagan once said, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So there's quite a fundamental mistrust.
Absolutely. This is a very unique American phenomenon. I don't think that any other Western country has something comparable, this deep anti-state kind of sentiment and distrust of federal government. China is, of course, at the opposite end on a spectrum. China has an extraordinarily centralized, unified government that is able to top-down enforce a uniform policy across the entire territory. And the US government is not set up to do that.
I agree. 实际上我们在谈论社会治理的时候，就会想起这样一句话，叫做“历史不会简单的自我重复，但是它总是似曾相识啊。History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes 。其实我们看到社会治理的发展的逻辑和背后的历史的演变，就会发现啊，这个危机是发挥着一个很重要的作用的。比如说，欧洲的黑死病对于欧洲所谓民族国家的形成和兴起，也是很重要的一个推动的作用。这个背后有一些什么样的历史的传承和文化的根性呢？
我觉得中国从地理条件上来看，就是主要是黄河和 与它相近的淮河的泛滥。因为黄河一旦出自然灾害以后，往往是影响了整个中原地区，人们不可能依靠家庭、村落或者是家族来治理，就要求有一种政治性的组织的出现，这是在中原地区发生古代中国的一个最重要的原因。
I don't agree very much because some of the problems that Professor Zhou outlined, they are not as old as Chinese civilization. Both problems of the control of the Yellow River and of the control of the nomads started actually in the early imperial period, because before in the pre-imperial period, Yellow River did not flood so much. It was just here, even called bright water, Ming Shui in the Chunqiu period, in the springs and autumns period.
但是呢，还有一个原因就是，大致以今天的长城这条界，北方是游牧民族，南方是农耕民族。一遇到气候寒冷，它可能的牛羊全部冻死，这就使北方游牧民族他不得不进入到中原来去掠夺这个农耕民族的，这就使农耕民族必须组织起来去抵抗北方的游牧民族。
Yes, to combat natural disasters and to combat external threats, it is very good to have efficient, centralized government. But I think that in China, the geography alone does not create unity. The Chinese system is an outcome of the inability of multiple states to coexist peacefully. The Warring States period was 2 centuries of the most devastating interstate warfare. There were hundreds of thousands of people died. The intellectually active part of Chinese society came to the conclusion, we have only one solution to achieve peace and prosperity. It is the unity. Stability is in unity. They crossed the borders from one state to another. All the intellectuals are speaking about Daitong, about the great unity, about one government, one emperor in all under heaven. And that is why this empire becomes so powerful ideologically. It is a hegemonic ideology, I would say, the ideology which everybody shares. And this created the foundation for the unity.
Thank you for your elaborations. 潘威教授，您觉得是有哪些因素决定了这样的一个传统？
在中国呢，因为没有雅利安征服，所以呢，他就保持了自己的一个早期的农耕状态，一个讲求实际的农耕的社会。这样呢，就构成了我们以国泰民安为核心价值。当一个文化过于精神主义的时候，就会产生绝对真理之类的想法，就容易产生社会分裂。但是对过好日子就不一样，就很容易达成共识。
From the Han Dynasty on, China has 2 cycles: make efficient government when you need it, and then relax, Fang and Shou, strengthen and relax, strengthen and relax. So China is not only in need of centralization, it also sometimes in need of decentralization without abandoning the potential of recentralization. This is what I believe is historical experience of China.
Professor Wimmer, well, in your book, Nation Building, you mentioned some conditions for ethno-political integration and national identification. Would you elaborate on those points?
Some countries that are linguistically heterogeneous or religiously heterogeneous, why have some of these countries fallen apart along these linguistic or religious fault lines, while others have actually come together? So I argue that one of the factors that can hold a population together in the contemporary period is a communicative platform that allows the building of political alliances all across these linguistic divides. There's 2 other factors that also kind of provide mechanisms how multi-ethnic, how diverse countries can actually coalesce around a shared identity and avoid kind of falling apart.
In terms of my understanding, it's about the grassroots organization and also more inclusive capability to provide public goods, right?
Yes, exactly. That also provides an organizational infrastructure for political alliances to crisscross the entire territory of a country, and the central government elites become attractive alliance partners that integrate speakers of different languages and believers in different gods.
我记得这个历史学家许倬云先生啊，在他的《万古江河》这本书当中，也对比了秦汉的这个制度和罗马的制度哈。他说，之所以中国是一个大一统的一个国家，而罗马呢，后来它是慢慢的这个分裂开来哈，可能有3个原因啊。第一个呢，就是在秦汉时候建立了郡县制度啊。第二呢，他认为呢是有这个汉语。第三呢，他提到了我们的发达的这个驿站、道路交通和河流的网络，把整个大中原地区吧，能够结成一个整体。如何来看待这种中西文化历史性制度安排的一种比较？
文字上、语言上的相对统一，这是影响极其深远。因为你想想，孔子能够周游列国，商鞅之所以能够到秦国去做宰相、大臣，就是因为他语言上是通的，文字上是通的。
苏秦还有6国相印呢，
像苏秦、张仪、乐毅、管仲等等都是这种情况，统一文字，这样就建立了官僚制，创造了基础。然后还有统一的赋税，这主要通过统一度量衡支撑一个官僚体制和一个军队制度，以及这个皇权，这样就把整个国家在政治组织上组织起来。
我会同意文字很重要，但是这个文字呢，不是统一不统一的问题，而是字母文字和象形文字的不同。字母文字很容易扩散，但是字母文字呢，根据不同地方的方言，你稍微一调整字母的系统，彼此就不懂了。所以这个字母文字容易分裂，而象形文字它的粘合力比较强，分裂性比较小，宽容性比较强。
我觉得许倬云先生他应当看到，他其实更重要的中国是一个农耕的中国，它本质上来说都是小农经济。但是在欧洲呢，围绕着地中海形成的罗马帝国，那么这样一个帝国，它实际上不是一个统治的，它是通过交通运输、贸易来联系的。如果是贸易的话，它一定更多是陌生人，更多是市出现 city。而如果是农村的话，它一定是 country， 更多的是村庄。在这种基础上，它的整个的这个制度基础都是不太一样的。我不是地理决定论者，这经济生产方式影响了这个制度的建立。
There were lots of empires with unified script. There was lots of empires with unified measurements. There was lots of empires with the idea that it's the realm of civilization and nothing else is basically thinkable. But what's unique to the Chinese empire is the bureaucratic mode of governance, that very early on, let's say, relatively meritocratic system of unified bureaucratic government, as opposed, for example, to medieval feudalism, as opposed also to the much more fragmented Roman system of governance, I think is behind the extraordinary stability of the Chinese empire. What brought it together is the shared interests of this bureaucratic class of governors that emerged with this peculiar way of administering and ruling a territory.
Well, thank you very much. Now we come to the question of the bureaucracy, the people who are executing policies. Where do they come from? 谁来做治理？谁来做执行？人才究竟是怎样被选拔的？这个方面肯定就要谈到中国的科举制度了哈。将近2000年前开始，在当年的这个全球的范围来说，应该说都是一个非常先进的一个制度安排。
从全国选拔政治精英，其实是有很大难题。西方国家包括英国、美国，很长时间没有办法形成文官制度。一个很重要的问题就是在这个地方，而中国是比较早解决了这个问题。一个就是说秦始皇的统一文字，使各地方的读书人有共同的文本。那么第二个就是汉武帝的罢黜百家，独尊儒术。 以儒家的《论语》作为一个最基本的教材。那么这就使得有了一个统一的考试的标准。由于官员在社会地位比较高，这也鼓励了许多小农家庭也会培养自己的子弟，学习完了以后去参加国家考试，然后让国家挑选，
也是一个跨越阶层的一个上升通道。
考试成绩优秀的留下来做官，成绩不优秀的回到他本乡本土去做僚。官员永远不允许到他的家乡去做官。而僚都是本地人，因此僚对官有制约，官也可以对僚有制约，不容易同地方财团或者是地主豪强勾结起来，这也不容易使国家分裂。
一个制度设计背后的它的智慧，
但是它背后还要有一个社会共识，就是王侯将相宁有种乎？这是中国人从一开始就不承认阶级。刘邦是大丈夫生当如斯，如果我是男子汉，我就该像秦始皇这样。然后项羽是说，彼可取而代之，只要他做的事情不能让天下满意，那么就可以有人来取代他。英雄不问出身，使得中国人都能接受普通人也可以去做官。如果没有这个前提，他的文官制度也不可能建立起来。在西方社会当中，文官没有早早建立起来，就是因为贵族制，他不允许社会底层能够通过考试就取代这个社会阶层。
Well, Professor Pines, in your book, you mentioned the mentality of 士 or 君子, and also their belief, their allegiance, not just to the emperor, but also to the Dao, to the 天下, to the people. Would you like to elaborate on some of your studies?
I think that social group which put the Chinese social fabric together were the intellectuals. They are in a very special position in comparison to intellectuals elsewhere because A, they were predestined to be political leaders. B, they were also very active as spiritual leader of society. Why this group was accepted as a leader? Because of meritocracy. Here, I think Professor Wilmer and then Professor Zhu Suli made very good points, because it was not a hereditary caste. It was not like Brahmins in India. It was not like the aristocrats in the ancient regime in France. And that is why this group was open, was adaptive, and it led China for 25 centuries. And even in the 20th century, despite all the changes, I would not downplay the importance of intellectuals. Even today's China, I think they play slightly higher role than in most other countries.
Well, many years ago, I had an interview with the founding leader of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and he said one of the major reasons to explain the success of Singapore was because they decided to adopt the effective and clean bureaucracy system from the UK. But then, of course, we learned that the UK's bureaucracy system also learned partially from the Chinese ways of, the selection of talents. So, Professor Wimmer, how would you compare the evolution of the bureaucracy in Europe as versus in China, and how did the federal lordship evolve into modern bureaucracy?
That's such a good question. In general, one could say the examination system and the bureaucracy that it established were very good for long-term political stability and integration. But one also has to admit that it was an ossified system. The canon, the Confucian or Neo-Confucian canon, did not evolve. So it means that very little learning, collective learning, was happening over the centuries from dynasty to dynasty. It was a system that was not able to absorb the Enlightenment, the rationalism.
中国在设计制度的时候，他做了精心的选择。他选的教材是《论语》，即使你考不上，你这个知识在农村仍然是有用的。但是这个也有一个问题。由于这种考试方法，它注定只能考人文，而自然科学、技术、工程学的这样东西是不容易进入考试，这也就造成了中国的近代的这种自然科学、技术 这没有发展起来。
所以这也是里约瑟之问嘛啊。
And then from the 16th, 17th, 18th century onward, when constant warfare in Europe, which contrasts with the peace in China, led to the development of highly centralized, highly effective bureaucracies. And they became even more efficient once they copied parts of the Chinese examination system, first in India under British rule, and then in Britain, and then in Germany, and so on and so on.
那既然谈到社会治理呢，我们当然要谈到普通的老百姓对于这些治理效果的或者是能力的一些评价。我们先通过一个小片来看一下年轻人们是怎样评价他们当地官员的表现的。
7, 6, 5 out of 10.
9分吧，10分。
I want to call it like a 4. I go to school here, but then I also work at a nightclub in downtown Long Beach, and seeing the differences of the guidelines being enforced at school compared to 10 minutes away at the nightclub are completely different.
刚才我们讲到中国在古代有了这样的一个科举制度，是人才选拔的制度那么怎么样确保政策是能够得到执行的，而且这个人才是有一种评价体系的？
我只能说呢，每一种选官制度都有它自己的社会结构基础，在这一点上，我会采取非常相对主义的态度。西方这种选择官员的办法呢，它可能会促使社会更分裂，这是坏的部分。好的部分呢，我觉得是更多的创造性，更多的选择性。那么呢，在中国这方面呢，好的部分是社会团结，而差的部分呢，就是官僚主义脱离人民。重要的是呢，让我们能够理解其他地方的制度的优势，那么我们想办法能够学习一部分。
So, Professor Pines, what are some of your observations on the evaluation of the effectiveness of bureaucracy?
They had absolutely amazingly effective system of evaluation, of evaluating everything, of performance control. Now, if the official was not responding to the urgent letter in 24 hours, he will be fined. It was a crazy system, very effective, but I think that it caused the collapse of the officials. The West, you elect officials, but when you elect officials, the elected officials will cater to the one group of the population, maybe use the identity politics, like in the city of Jerusalem, we have completely malfunctioning city government because it serves the largest block of the voters, the Orthodox religious people, and nobody really checks what is the ability of the elected official.
You know, sometimes in certain societies, we have a very good checks and balance system so that it's they call it vetocracy. Everyone tried to veto each other, so get nothing done. And I read a statistic back in the 50s of the last century. In the US, about 5% of total employment worked for the government. But now that ratio has come down to only 2%. Professor Wimmer, is that so?
In today's world, political clientelism, including in many one-party regimes, but not only, also in some Western democracies, is a big problem. So I think the best bureaucracies are those that combine two principles. One, it's meritocracy, as it has already been mentioned several times, in the recruitment procedure. And the second one is that the civil service, the bureaucracies have to be attractive. They have to pay high salaries. I am a big fan of Singapore, and they have a ruthless, or let's say an effective meritocratic system of recruitment. The high-ranking civil service members have very high salaries that are competitive with the private sector. The German civil service is also very, very well organized. Most of these people have PhDs. Denmark also has a very highly efficient civil service. Meritocracy and then high salaries lead to the recruitment of good people who are actually efficient in organizing the apparatus of the state.
其实当我们在谈到好的治理的时候，我们很容易举一些例子，比如说如何到达丹麦啊，或者举到新加坡的例子。但是我们发现呢，这种小的国家的一种治理模式，一旦被放大到一个大的国家，比如说美国、中国、印度似乎这个问题一下就变得非常的复杂起来了。我知道这个朱教授对于中国的乡土乡村有着很深的了解，你也写过书，比如《送法下乡》你就会发现这个地方治理的时候，它其实还靠的不仅仅是一种理念，还需要有考虑到当地非常复杂的和个性化的一些情况，是不是这样？
是。传统中国的基层治理，皇权不下乡，皇权不下县，从中央政府派出来县官基本上不会去管到农村的事情。那么基层治理主要是靠儒家的一些原则来治理。那么最主要就是父慈子孝，长幼有序。父亲要履行自己的职责，儿子要履行儿子的职责，在兄弟之间要有竞争，同时又要保证这种竞争不能够造成的秩序的混乱，借助了父子和兄弟关系来治理。近代以后开始现代化以后，城市化以后，农村最聪明的那批人逐步流失了，这就使得中国的农村变成了一个弱点。这就是为什么在过去7、8年来，中央强调这个扶贫攻坚，强调这个驻村第一书记、大学生村官，都是要解决这个问题，需要这个国家的权力不断地向农村来帮助那些自己缺少政治精英的这种离散的这种群体能够重新组织起来。
In very dynamic and pluralistic societies as they are around the world, it has posed a very serious challenge to local governance. So, Professor Wimmer, from your point of view, how can we enhance the cohesion of a society and reach our common codes of governance and livelihood?
And there's various experiments in various parts of the US and different cities for Europe using voting techniques, using smartphones and so on to actually bring citizens more closer into the local government process. That also has to do with finances. A lot of the problems with fiscal decentralization, with fiscal autonomy at the municipal level, they are exacerbating inequalities. Poorer municipalities cannot afford good public services. Rich municipalities can afford much better services. So all of this, the fiscal aspects of it and the downsides of fiscal decentralization need to be somehow balanced with these ideas of increased citizen participation.
I just think that to complicate it more, when we speak about local governance, we once assumed that the people are living in the same place for a considerable period of time, and then they develop the local identity and the local awareness, etc., etc. But in our very mobile world, when we move from one place to another, it becomes even more complicated to take into account permanent and non-permanent residents. So one of the challenges, which I don't know how it will be addressed by the local governments, is how to take into consideration the huge flexibility of the population, which is, I hope, will be resumed once the pandemic is more or less over.
While reading Francis Fukuyama, I was very interested in his way of analysis. So said there is an end of history. So my question is, do you agree with his ways of analysis, and do you believe in the end of history? Is our history still evolving and changing and adapting, or there's the end of it?
History cannot end. The first one who declared the end of history was the first emperor of China. When he unified all under heaven, he wrote this on the steles. Before myself, it was continuous war and bloodshed. Now I have unified all under heaven and never war. And of course, in 14 years, the dynasty collapsed out of the peasant rebellion of huge ferocity and huge devastation. So the history never ends, and we cannot evaluate its future outcomes. But I think that the good governance is the one which responds to changing situation. I don't have one uniform solution for the future because I don't know the future. I think that all the time you need to learn and adapt.
I think there is broad trends and patterns that you can discern in history. And one of the most important patterns in the last 200 years was that empires that existed 200 years ago were all replaced with nation states. If you look at the world before the French Revolution, there were the colonial empires, there was Habsburg, you had the Ottoman Empire, or you had the Romanov Empire, and so on and so on. So sovereignty now is thought of as coming from the people and no longer from God or from a dynasty as in empires. So that's basically very hard to imagine how the world will look like in 200 years. Does it mean that we will have a world state, just one state governing the entire humanity? Does it mean that the state will disappear and that we will live in decentralized, technologically mediated networks that organize solidarity and so on? So it's completely impossible to answer this question.
So you also agree we cannot see the end of history then? 我们呢生活在一个全球化的一个时代，资本、人、信息、病毒啊，都在一种开放的体系当中加速的传播着。所以其实这个时候对于治理也提出了更多的挑战。联合国呢有一个预计到2050年的时候，全世界会有2/3的人都生活在城市里，就是人们的这种聚集的程度也正在不断的增加的过程当中。那我们通过一个小片来看一下年轻人们对于一个全球化的时代他们认为有一些什么样的挑战，有没有什么解决之道呢？
Hunger, homelessness,
climate change,
Overpopulation.
and California's in a drought right now.
Poverty, climate change,
security and privacy,
affordable housing,
One-sidedness.
和平的问题，
能源的开发和枯竭，
各国发展的一个不平衡、不均衡的问题，不够团结导致很多愚昧和无知。
例如疫情这种情况，全世界都会跟他一起对抗病毒，可是大家始终2年了，还是没有办法有任何共识。
We're just not unified, right? And I think even in our own country, we have the Republicans, the Democrats. If we really want this country to thrive, we all have to be on the same page.
We just can't get along, especially in the US. This is a problem, just like political divisiveness, the fact that we can't even have a conversation with people that we don't agree with anymore.
Emotional struggle. I think everyone in the pandemic has gone through something emotionally, and I think it's taken a toll on all of us.
The inequality. There's just so much corruption in all these big corporations and these world leaders, and all they care about is these like profit incentives, and
not enough people want to do anything about it, and that's very concerning. And the signs are there, it's here, but no one really wants to work on it as much as we should.
Well, 年轻人对这个世界存在的问题，其实是有着更加敏锐的一种观察和一种热切的关注哈，所以也想请我们的4位嘉宾也来聊一聊，在这样一个全球化的今天，人类真正面临的一个治理的困境究竟在什么地方？
我觉得地缘政治以这个词为标志的政治共同体之间的竞争，会让我们合作越来越艰难，但是我们就越来越需要合作。这个矛盾，这个悖论，我真的不知道怎么能解决。
The possibility of cooperation are not very good, and they are getting worse and worse, especially as the China-U.S. relationships seems to become ever more contentious. On the other hand, actually, everybody sits in the same boat. So in the immediate future, let's say the next 10 years or 20 years, maybe a different architecture of global governance can emerge from these kind of experiences.
Thank you very much. And Professor Pines, how about taking such a solution as to enhance the existing global governance structures Are you pessimistic or optimistic?
First of all, I'm very pessimistic because I don't see now we're going to good global governance. I think that Mr. Trump accelerated the destruction of the international system, but this system was under pressure even before. For 200 years, the Western civilization dominated the globe. And the Western civilization convinced itself that its value system is a universal value system, and that its ideas are universal ideas, and those who don't adopt need to be educated. And today, the challenge is to understand we shall forever remain in a diverse world. There are different views of human rights, there are different views of political system, and I don't think they will converge. I don't even think that they need to converge. They are completely different, and each of them develops in their own way, fit into its own patterns, and you cannot turn India into China or China into India. Both will collapse immediately. So to create a new globalized world, which Professor Wilmer was speaking about, we need respect to each other political system. Don't preach each other how you should behave. Let us focus on the common set of goals, but it will be very difficult for the West. I think most of the Western audience will not be glad listening to me saying these words.
So in other words, we have to realize there's no clear-cut universal solution to our different challenges, or the single most correct or successful model that will suit everyone. 朱苏丽教授，我们4位嘉宾当中已经有3位是悲观主义者了啊！您是不是能给我们一点不同的色彩和希望？
中国人有句话就是“尽人力，听天命”。我在这个意义上我也有一点悲观，但是我们现在大家至少已经，越来越多的人意识到我们的命运其实是拴在一起的，因此我们可能先从具体的事情去做，走一步算一步。
您还是一个务实主义者啊，an optimistic pragmatist。好吧，那么其实我们的年轻人对于改变这个世界或者找到问题的解决方案，也是充满了创造力的。我们先来听一下年轻人的回答。
Education, maybe specifically on mental health.
Higher education for everyone, free college, free tuition.
Write in some laws to make sure that there is, for sure, affordable housing.
Just provide free resources. I think when your basic needs aren't met, you're not going to be listening to all the stuff that's coming out over and over again.
去帮助一些值得帮助或者是需要帮助的人，因为很多人他们的这个政治地位、社会地位不够高，可能更大的是来自于他们的经济实力不够强。
No xenophobia, no racism, no sexism. It doesn't matter, what I look like or what color I am or religion I believe in or ethnicity. I think as long as everybody just respects each other, that's a utopia there.
桃花源式的大同世界，
桃花源记里那样的，人与人之间可以非常简单自然的相处，然后最重要的是人和自然、人与环境之间也可以。
人人为我，我为人人，天下大同，天下为公的社会。
它一定是尊重弱者的，是大家能够普遍接受的，是能够让每一个个体都能够得到自由发展的。
I would say the first step in any utopian society is a universal basic income. When a human being's worth is assigned not to themselves but their productivity, it's just you're inherently in a dystopian space.
Well, many of these young people mentioned utopian society or 桃花源, the peach colony, which is the Chinese version of a utopian society. I noticed that Professor Pines nodded upon that.
I hope these young people will continue be so optimistic and hoping for the Datong, for the great unity. I am much more pessimistic when I was in their age. But the only thing which I hope will still somehow recover is a mutual respect between different civilizations, between different political systems, between different cultures. And the foundation of this mutual respect is a mutual understanding, which will be the first step to the new, better world.
Yeah. Professor Wimmer, I know that by reading your story, you were quite idealistic when you were young.
That's true.
That's true. So, have you compromised, or what's your suggestion to these young people?
What I find striking is that people around the world, these young people, actually want very similar things. So I kind of disagree with the idea that we live in a completely different world, that people of different civilizational background have different values. If you look at survey data from around the world, then you can actually see that more and more people are converging about gender, ideas about racial equality, ideas about human dignity. So there is a shared human civilization with shared aspirations and shared ideals, especially among the younger generation that are more connected with each other than ever. And so I'm actually hopeful that on this shared fundament, a better political future might be able or could emerge.
Okay, by listening to these young people, you're turning from pessimistic to somewhat optimistic.
我觉得孔子描述的大同世界，那是可能的。我期待我们的年轻人、小孩儿会受到更好、越来越好的均等化的教育，我们的老人会得到越来越好的均等化的照顾。
希望永远都是年轻人，值得去追求的，而且他们也会去追求的。这个世界不可能很快的变好。甚至可能有的时候偶尔还会变坏，但是每个人都要去努力。当科学技术发展以后，许多人类的许多原来的价值或者制度上的差别都可能慢慢的缩小。也许我看不到，因此我自己只是这么期望，然后自己做自己的努力。
谢谢我们的几位嘉宾真诚的分享。疫情期间呢，我看到了一组孩子们的美术作品啊，题目叫做《平凡的爱》，是孩子们通过自己的观察，去发现周围的成年社会当中的普通人在疫情当中的表现。给我留下深刻印象的，包括有的孩子画的是自己的父母啊，如何拿出自家的口罩送给不相识的陌生人。有一个孩子呢说他的奶奶是清洁工，疫情期间仍然呢每天早晨4点钟起来去打扫街道，虽然街道上并没有人，但是他希望保持这个城市的清洁。这些孩子的作品让我想到，当我们成年人在忙于应对危机的时候，我们的孩子们正在用心观察着我们，看我们如何应对挑战，又是如何对待彼此。我想合作是人类社会的基本特征之一吧。意识到这一点，我们将怎样面对孩子的眼睛，又将留给他们一个怎样的世界呢？感谢你收看这一期的文化相对论，我们下期见。文化相对论当中的“相对”一词有2重含义：一是每个民族、每个国家有自己的文化根性；二是我们的交流互鉴能够彼此启发，并且带来合作。欢迎各位。
推动这件事儿，就是为了我们这个地球的未来。
The poverty is many diseases, just like cancer.
You change one thing, it has so many unforeseen consequences.
Globalization has come, so here is a challenge.
中国在1000年以前就做到了这一点。
It is a totally different culture.
我们应该遵循自然的发展。
Nothing against the grain.
希望能看到各个国家的年轻人能够在一起去解决我们人类面临的问题。